Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another serial killer spotlight video. I was feeling adventurous this month and thought I'd go for a more historical case. As we all know, I love a little bit of history. It does mean though that this is going to be a little less fact-based and a bit more speculation. In these usual videos I go through the childhood of the killer, do a bit of psychoanalysis, but it's difficult to do that when the case is from the 1500s. This is the oldest case I've ever covered actually on this channel, I think. Elizabeth Bathory has been described as the most vicious female serial killer to ever exist. I would probably up that and say maybe the most vicious serial killer, full stop. Her story is brutal and she's been accused of killing up to 650 people between 1590 and 1610. Although the number is debated, it's definitely thought to be in the hundreds, so high that she's actually secured herself a place in the Guinness Book of Records as the most murder victims ever. What a thing to be known for. At least that's what we know of. Controversially, there's actually a lot of speculation that Elizabeth may not have been a murderer at all, or that the number was significantly lower than that, maybe around 35 victims. That's the thing with history and historical cases. The stories get twisted and changed, and we'll never know for sure what really happened. So let's start with a little we do know about Elizabeth's childhood. She was born in Transylvania in 1560 to a relatively distinguished family. Nowadays, Transylvania is commonly associated with vampires and darkness, mostly thanks to Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was based on the true life story of Vlad the Impaler. Elizabeth's story definitely lends to the area its spooky reputation, even before Bram Stoker decided to set his novel there. Elizabeth is actually often referred to as the Blood Countess or the real Countess Dracula. Today, Transylvania is just a region within modern-day Romania, but Elizabeth and her family were Hungarian, which I'm sure means there's going to be a whole lot of words in this video that I absolutely butcher. I've relied a lot on Google Translate, the little audio button, to teach me how to pronounce these words. Elizabeth was born into a family that included kings, cardinals and knights. Her uncle was Stephen Bathory, the Prince of Transylvania. He would later go on to become the King of Poland. The Bathory family ruled Transylvania as a virtually independent principality within the Kingdom of Hungary. They had a lot of power. She was born into wealth and an excellent social position, but she was also considered to be incredibly beautiful with lustrous black hair and pale skin, and she was provided with a top-notch education. Elizabeth literally had everything in life that would make her unstoppable. She was the very top of the hierarchy. Only there was a small problem with the Bathory family. They were kind of sadistic, a little bit psychopathic. As with many noble royal families at this time, and for many centuries following, there were issues with inbreeding and incest. The bloodlines had to be kept pure, and so for centuries the Bathorys had married within themselves, but this led to a whole range of genetic problems, many of them likely to be linked to their mental health. Elizabeth was exposed to incredible violence from a very young age, and she was literally never told that violence was bad. Reports from her childhood say that she suffered herself with incredible fits of rage from a really young age, so bad that it would literally send her into seizures. Nowadays it's thought that she may have actually suffered with epilepsy, which would account for the fits and the rage and the seizures. Historical accounts often talk about how, as a child, Elizabeth would witness her father's officers torture the peasants that lived near the family's estates. For no reason, just for fun torture. She also witnessed a thief be sewn into the stomach of a dying horse and left to die, or at least that's what stories say. Horses are actually very expensive, so they probably wouldn't have wasted a horse in that way. One of her uncles considered himself a Satanist and would teach Elizabeth all about it, whilst her aunt taught her all about sadomasochism. But this wasn't particularly out of ordinary for this time. It was a little bit more violent than usual, but it wasn't crazy. In general, the 1600s were a lot more violent than nowadays. Even for me personally, the thought of capital punishment is pretty abhorrent. It actually sometimes shocks me to remember that the death penalty is still a thing across much of the world, across much of the Western world as well. But in the 1500s, it was very normal that if you were caught committing a crime, you would be killed. I'm not even referring to murder or horrific crimes like that. You could steal a loaf of bread and be put to death for it. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that death was a lot more normalised back in these times. Elizabeth also grew up in a time where there was a lot of political and religious upset in the region. Hungary became the scene of continuous fighting. There were the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperors, the Ottomans and the native nobility of Hungary, all fighting to rule. When she was 11 or 12 years old, she was betrothed to a man called Ferenc Nadasdy, who came from another aristocratic Hungarian family. It was a very suitable match. Some sources talk of how Elizabeth reportedly then went on to fall pregnant the very next year, not by the man she was betrothed to, but by a man of lower class, a servant, and she went on to have a daughter. Ferenc would go on to have the servant castrated and thrown to wild dogs to be eaten alive. The baby girl was named Anastasia Bathory, and that's the end of records of her. Perhaps she was given to someone to raise away from the family, or perhaps friends fed her to the dogs as well. Once Elizabeth had become betrothed to Ferenc, her education became the responsibility of her future mother-in-law, Osolya Nadasdy. Education included the standard reading and writing and languages, of course, but also how to do daily chores and care for her husband. It's reported that Elizabeth spoke many languages, including Hungarian, Slovak, French, Greek, and more. She was a very educated young woman by all standards. Regardless of the whole bastard pregnancy thing, Elizabeth and Ferenc were married when she was 14 or 15 years old. It's reported that 4,500 people were invited to the wedding. It was this huge ordeal. Because she socially outranked her husband, she got to keep her name, and some reports say that he added Bathory to his own. By today's standards, they were an incredibly young couple. They were still children, but by 1500 standards, this was pretty normal, getting married when you were 14. After they were married, the couple settled into Csejte Castle, which is in modern-day Slovakia. Ferenc was a soldier and was often away from home, leaving Elizabeth to run the estate alone for the most part. Because this wasn't just a castle. Elizabeth now owned the castle, the country house, and the surrounding 17 small villages. Elizabeth and Ferenc were in charge of them all. The couple didn't really spend much time together, but Elizabeth would go on to bore more children. Whether or not they were all her husbands is not entirely sure. She took various lovers whilst her husband was away at war across Europe. They all took the name Nadasdy though. Anna, Osolya, Katalin, Andrus and Paul. The last two, the boys, both died as young children. There are mentions of other Nadashdys around this time in the history books, but it's unsure if they are distant cousins or were indeed children of the couple. All the children were raised by governesses though. Elizabeth had very little to do them, as was the norm in nobility at this time. She never really wanted children, believing they would just enslave her, but it was considered to be the only job of a young woman at the time, to bear children. It was 3 years into the marriage that Ferenc was appointed chief commander of the Hungarian troops, and so he leaves the estate to go and fight against the Ottomans in Europe. Elizabeth is left alone once again to rule the estate, which really wasn't an easy job. You'd probably be forgiven for thinking Elizabeth was simply a lady of nobility and therefore she had a fairly easy life. But it seems like running this estate was a lot of work. She was in charge of 17 small villages. That's a lot of people. She was responsible for making sure there was enough work and food for the people, dealing with any arguments or discrepancies, protecting the estate from outside attacks, which was a real issue at the time. Villages were often plundered and ransacked during this time by the Ottomans. She ruled with an iron fist, but it seemed like she was actually very well liked as a leader. The people respected her, she was very fair, which makes what she would apparently go on to do even crazier. Because of course this is a serial killer spotlight video, and Elizabeth Bathory loved to kill. And it seems like people knew that Elizabeth Bathory loved to kill. Rumour has it that friends knew of his wife's sadistic tendencies so well that he actually built her a torture chamber within the castle just to please her. He mostly stayed out of the actual murdering though, he just let his wife get on with the hobby as she pleased. Once, upon returning from battle, friends found a young servant girl tied to a pole naked outside. Her body was covered in honey, which attracted ants and flies who were literally just like feasting on her. When he questioned his wife, she simply said that she'd caught the girl stealing fruit from her room. And she'd put the girl there and covered her in honey as a very apt punishment, I suppose. Ferenc Nadasdy died in January 1604 at the age of just 48 after a years-long illness. The two had been married for 29 years at the time of his death. After her husband's death, rumours spread across the kingdom about Elizabeth Bathory and her very unusual hobby. Whilst her husband was alive, she'd done quite a good job at keeping her penchant for torture on the down low, but after his death, it seemed like she stopped caring as much. She couldn't act as freely when she had her husband's reputation to uphold, but after he died, it didn't really matter anymore. She had a particular penchant for murdering young girls. She enjoyed capturing and torturing them. At first, her victims were servants at the castle who were often daughters of the local peasants. Eventually, the local people began to realise that every time they sent their daughters to work at the castle, they'd mysteriously disappear. They just wouldn't come home again. But it wasn't as simple as easy as just not sending your daughters to work at the castle anymore. There was actually a law at the time which essentially bound the peasants into slavery. They had to work for their owners, the lords and the ladies of their estates, at least one day a week for free. Manual labour. A job at the castle was considered to be one of the best positions to have, but there wasn't really the option of just not sending your daughters anymore. They were bound by slavery to do so. Seemingly, Elizabeth had a particular interest in human blood. This occurred one evening whilst one of her many servant girls was combing her hair and the servant accidentally pulled on it. Elizabeth didn't react there and then, but she just waited and watched this girl later playing a game with another servant where they attempted to prick each other with needles. Elizabeth took the needle off the girl and pricked the girl who'd hurt her, but she takes it one step further. She then licks up the blood and rubs it on her cheeks. Some sources go further to say that Elizabeth noticed the next morning that her skin looked younger, more youthful. She becomes obsessed with this idea that human blood made her more youthful. So from then on, she would often prick her servants with needles if they stepped out of line, as well as biting them, actually drawing blood. And over time, the punishments began to grow. It just snowballed out of control. She enjoyed inflicting pain on these young girls who displeased her, and slowly she built up a very impressive collection of torture devices, such as Iron Maidens. She had one which was this cage lined with sharp blades that would be lifted to the ceiling, just ripping through the victim's flesh. She was also apparently a fan of the death by water technique, in which the person would be taken outside in the middle of winter, in Eastern Europe no less, and have water thrown on them until they literally froze to death. She would often bathe in her victims' blood, believing the blood gave her power, that she would get this never-ending youth. A quote which reportedly came from Elizabeth herself reads, "I grew up listening to stories about the miraculous restorative powers of blood. Hungarian folklore awash in blood. Blood and beauty are wedded in fairy tales, folk sayings and conventional wisdom. Given this red liquid medium in which I spent my life, it would have been surprising if I didn't bathe in blood. To bathe in blood was simply to acknowledge the literal reality." So she believed blood has some kind of magical power. It suggested that Elizabeth experienced both sexual and psychological gratification from her crimes, and it may well have been linked to her suggested epilepsy. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert on epilepsy by any means. I actually know very little about the illness, and this was all new to me whilst I was researching this case. I didn't know there was a link between epilepsy and violence at all. But I actually found an article on the National Institute of Health website which suggested that whilst rare, aggressive and violent behaviours have been associated with epilepsy, especially temporal or frontal lobe seizures. If Elizabeth did have this rare form of epilepsy that caused her to act out in violence, that, combined with the time in which she grew up and her family's propensity towards violence, it's not surprising that she would end up doing the things that she did. Later, Elizabeth began to prey on the girls sent to her by local noble families who were sent to learn good manners and etiquette. This was her mistake, I think, because families of higher standing would be a lot more vocal about their daughters going missing than peasants would be. Plus, they had the resources, the money to investigate. Rumours have been flying around about the practices at Csejte and Sabrina castles for a long time. It's believed that Elizabeth was murdering girls there for 20 plus years. People heard things, people noticed things. Gossip spread about the evil that took place there. In the early 1600s, a Lutheran pastor complained to the aristocracy in Vienna about Elizabeth, but it took a number of years before anything was done about this complaint. It was 1610 when King Matthias Corvinus II of Hungary and Croatia assigned a man called Jörg Thurzo to investigate what was going on. He heads the estate and begins questioning the local villagers and household staff. They told him everything he needed to know about Elizabeth's behaviour, and also that when people stopped sending their girls to the castles, she would send officers out just to kidnap them. She was obsessed with young girls and torture. Only 2 witnesses, though, ever claimed to have actually seen the Countess torturing and killing a victim. Most never saw anything at all. It was just hearsay, spooky rumours coming from the castle, and the fact the girls kept ending up dead or missing. But Elizabeth hears that she is being investigated, looked into, and so she takes the mother of a girl who'd been in her service to the local court. This mother testifies that her daughter had indeed died whilst in Elizabeth's service, but it was of disease, natural causes, and not at her mistress's hand. Elizabeth thinks this should be enough to cover her back. But of course it's not. Despite the accusations building against her, Elizabeth doesn't leave Hungary, which you would think would be the obvious thing to do. But simply, she was a lady of luxury, and anywhere else in Europe she probably wouldn't have been able to live the life that she'd been accustomed to. And she had to get permission from the king to even leave the country, and he probably wasn't going to give her permission, seeing as he was the one who'd ordered the investigation into her. But also the accusations came to a head in the winter time, and it would have been very hard for her to travel, the roads snow covered and incredibly cold. It was also for this reason that she assumed though that the officers, the police, if they came to arrest her, couldn't reach her. If she couldn't leave the castle, then they couldn't get to her. She was wrong. Or there's also the possibility that she was so consumed by her evil, perhaps even her witchcraft, that she thought herself invincible. She wasn't, of course. On December 30th, 1610, Thurzo arrests Elizabeth, along with 4 servants who had been accused of being her accomplices. The men sent to arrest her report finding at least 2 bodies in the castle. But this wasn't all kind of straightforward. It was Thurzo's job to avoid a public scandal, and despite her crimes, Elizabeth was still a Bathory, and they were one of the most powerful families in Hungary at this time. You didn't want to piss off the Bathorys. We've already spoken about how violent they were. So Thurzo writes a letter to the king, in which he says he's caught the Countess in the act, and he had to arrest her and pronounce his sentence for life imprisonment there and then. The letter refers to the fact that she'd apparently killed 300 girls, but it says nothing of the torture. If the king had known of the torture that led to the deaths, he possibly would have sentenced Elizabeth to death there and then, but Thurzo knew better. The king did insist on a trial though, which began in January 1611. Elizabeth wasn't even present, but her accomplices were, who were all found guilty and sentenced to death. Many people took the stand and testified against Elizabeth, but importantly, very few of them, if any, ever saw anything. Every testimony was just based on rumours they'd heard. Reportedly, the witnesses who did say they'd first-hand seen the murder only admitted so after being tortured themselves by Thurzo. There's something very funny about a woman who's taken to trial on torture charges, and then the courts using torture themselves as a way of extracting information from the witnesses. A bit of cognitive dissonance there, perhaps. 3 of the accomplices were sentenced to death for being an accomplice to murder, and the executions contained some of the practices that Elizabeth used on her own victims. I don't think this was done on purpose. I think it just goes to show how brutal this time was in general. This included nails being ripped from fingers with hot tongs, beheadings, and being burnt alive at the stake. But what about Elizabeth herself? Her bloodline and money was her saving grace here, showing that class really was everything in this time. She was just locked up in her castle, kept in a narrow tower without any windows, with just a few small holes in the wall to provide her with sufficient light and air. She was kept there, confined, alone for 4 years, until she died in August 1615. The night before she died, she complained that she was cold to the guards, who told her just to lie down. The next morning, she was dead. Nobody really knows what caused her death. Noble men and women of the time would be buried months after their deaths, their bodies kept underground covered in blocks of ice until all funeral arrangements had been organised. And despite everything that Elizabeth had done, she was still buried as a noblewoman. It's insane. She was given more dignity than the people who were accused of just being accomplices, likely they were just there when she was doing her torturing. They were all sentenced to death. Elizabeth was given dignity, just hide away in a tower until you die. I mean, it's still not great, but it's better, isn't it? But of course, the story of Elizabeth Bathory isn't as straightforward as history would make you think, because there's actually a number of historians who believe that she was never a murderer at all, but rather just a victim of political, religious conspiracies, that she was essentially framed. She was a powerful woman who had extensive wealth, and she owned large areas of Hungary. After her husband died, she held an extraordinary amount of power, and the men didn't really like it. Elizabeth was also a Protestant, and there was a lot of disrest between the Catholics and Protestants, as there always was. Was all of this simply a plot by the Catholics to get rid of her power and her influence? Probably not, as the investigation was actually sparked by a Lutheran minister, and Lutheranism is one of the largest branches of Protestantism. Although Elizabeth was raised as Calvinist, not Lutheran, so there possibly could have been some tension there, as she always refused to convert to her husband's Lutheran faith. But still, I don't think any Protestant minister would want her killed for that. There's also been questions over the 300 plus witnesses used to convict Elizabeth, because very few of them, if any, ever reported seeing anything. It was all based on rumours and hearsay. Who's to say the rumours were even true? Maybe they were started by someone who didn't like Elizabeth at all. Maybe Thurzo started the rumours himself because disgracing Elizabeth would greatly benefit his own political ambitions. Thurzo was known to be on a quest for power. His own family was powerful, but not as powerful as the Bathorys. They were his biggest rivals, along with the Nadashtis. You can see how by arresting Elizabeth and maybe hyping up the charges against her a little bit, it could very much benefit him and his sons. He said that his officers found bodies in the castle, that he caught her in the act, but did they really? It's possible that the entire story of Elizabeth Bathory is nothing more than folklore based on false accusations. There's no denying that girls definitely died whilst under the care of Elizabeth, but this was the 1600s and people would get a paper cut and die from the infection in those days. Though it certainly makes for a better story that she was a sadistic woman who drank the blood of young girls to maintain her youth. The fact of the matter is, now, over 600 years later, we're probably never going to know the truth of who Elizabeth Bathory was and the extent of her crimes, if there were ever any crimes at all. Was she just victimised for being a powerful woman? We'll never know. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is a case that I've been wanting to learn about for a really long time, so I'm really glad that I delved into this because it was a lot more interesting than I thought it would be. Let me know who you want to see me cover in next month's Serial Killer Spotlight video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.